Question number 9, Darroch Ball.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister for Whānau Ora, does he stand by all his statements?
Speaker.
The Honourable Te Rāwha Flavel.
Ai, I te wā e kōrero hian.
Supplementary.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, Darroch Ball.
Does he stand by his answer on measures of effectiveness provided to justify the increase in funding to Whānau Ora, that, quote, the increase in funding for Whānau Ora was subject to a cost-benefit analysis consistent with other budget 2016 social sector initiatives?
The Honourable Te Rāwha Flavel.
Ai.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Darroch Ball.
How could he possibly use the cost-benefit analysis as justification for an increase in funding when that cost-benefit analysis clearly states that the, quote, benefits achieved through Whānau Ora is difficult to capture using cost-benefit analysis, end quote?
The Honourable Te Rāwha Flavel.
Mr Speaker, ara no nā momo toronga o Whānau Ora. Ko kitea I roto I ngā pūrongo, ko whakahokia.
Point of order, Tracy Martin.
So can we confirm that there is a translation going on?
Certainly. Order. Order. There is a translation and it would be helpful if members listen to it. The Honourable Te Rāwha Flavel. Order. The Honourable Te Rāwha Flavel.
Speaker, e tika ana kia whai a hau a mini tenei I tēnei kaupapa te cost-benefit analysis. Ko eke a Whānau Ora ki tērā taumata, kāre he rere kētanga ki ētahi atu o ngā tari o te kāwanatanga, ko tau āhua no, ka whakamātauria, ia tau, ia tau, ia tau.
Point of order, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr Speaker, this Minister was asked as to how he could make that statement, given that he had on record from a government department a statement about the impossibility of a cost-benefit analysis, the way it was being put in his answer. He has not tried, he was asked that, how could he say that against that official information that he got, and he did not in any way try to answer the question.
Order, no, the question was not as the member has now summarised it. It was quite different, somewhat different, and as I listened to the answer addressed the question that was asked.
Point of order.
Point of order.
So just to clarify your ruling, are you saying that what I heard from the Minister was not what he said?
No, let me try and clarify for the benefit of the member. The question that the member, Winston Peters, suggested was asked was not exactly the same as Darroch Ball asked. I listened to what Darroch Ball asked, and I have ruled that the answer given by the Honourable Te Rāwha Flavel has addressed that question. That is the end of the matter. There's not much point in continuing.
Point of order, Speaker.
Point of order. Right, Honourable Winston Peters.
With respect, I helped draft this question, so I know what's on it.
Order. Member will resume his seat. Order. I have ruled that the question has been addressed. Now, the member doesn't have to agree with that, but he has to accept it. We will move to further supplementaries. Otherwise, I'm quite happy to move to the next question. Order. I am certainly not going to entertain a further point of order from the Right Honourable Winston Peters contesting my ruling, and if he does so, I will be asking him to leave the chamber.
Order, Speaker.
Point of order. Can I just...
First of all...
Member will resume his seat. I just want to be... Sit down. Resume your seat, please. I just want to be absolutely clear. Order. I want to be absolutely clear. I've given the member a warning that I'm not prepared to tolerate him continuing to raise a point of order that's challenging a ruling I've just given. Now, if the member wishes to seek a fresh point of order on a completely different matter, that is a right that he has, and I'll listen to it. But if I detect for... The member will leave the chamber. The member will leave the chamber. Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I'd ask you to reflect on the likely order in the House if, when ruling on a point of order that has been raised by an opposition member, you are subject to a barrage of abuse and members on this side are subject to a barrage of abuse from the government side. If the shoe was on the other foot and you were being asked to rule on a point of order from the government and we were to yell and scream and yahoo all the way through that, I think you would have something to say about that.
Order. I accept the point the member's making. It is certainly unhelpful, but the behaviour we've just seen is completely unacceptable, and I would think that most people who have any respect for this place at all would accept that. It does cause some excitement. Mr Peters was asked to leave. He certainly took some time to leave the chamber, and there was a fair bit of interjection from my right-hand side, which is not acceptable. I accept the point the member's making. Further supplementary, Darroch Ball.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order. Darroch Ball.
I seek leave to table a document which is an OIA from the Minister for Whānau Ora dated 25 August 2016 entitled Cost Benefit Analysis Template Whānau Ora Growing Whānau Coverage and Reach, which states that it is difficult to analyse.
Order. The document's been well and truly described. I'll put the leave. Leave is sought to table that particular OIA. Is there any objection to it being tabled? There is not. It can be tabled. Supplementary question, Darroch Ball.
Can you confirm that 50 provider contracts and their associated funding have been transferred from MSD to Whānau Ora when Whānau Ora is exiting 30 of those contracts but keeping the millions of dollars that came with them?
The Honourable Te Urura Flavel.
Kyle.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order, Darroch Ball.
I seek leave to table two documents. The first is an OIA from MSD, dated 13 April 2016, entitled Transfer of Vote Social Development Funding to Support Whānau Ora, Progressing Transfer
Order,
of...
that document's been described enough. Second doc.
Do you want to know the title of it or not?
Order. The member's very close to now following his leader. I have said that's enough of a description for it to be put. I'll now hear from the second document.
The second document, sir, is Treasury advice against the transfer of those contracts and funds. An OIA from MSD dated 24 April 2015, entitled Report on Options for Transferring Programs to Whānau Ora.
Leave is sought to table those two particular documents. Is there any objection to them being tabled? There is not. They can be tabled.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Darroch Ball.
Why has the Minister for Social Development given him a $3 million slush fund out of the Ministry of Social Development budget, and why is it assigned to his delegation if it's nothing but a massive slush fund to be used by him?
Either of those two supplementary questions, the Honourable Te Urura Flavel.
Ki te pātai tuatai ka reo te paku whakai ki tāne kōrerona.
Supplementary. Sorry. Correction. Point of order, sir.
Sorry, point of order?
Point of order.
Point of order, Darroch Ball.
I seek leave to table a document, which is an OIA from MSD, 6th of May 2015, entitled Assigning Responsibility of Funding and Vote Social Development to the Minister for Whānau Ora, showing the $3 million uncommitted
Order,
fund
that's enough of a description. Leave us sought to table that particular document. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled. Point of order, Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know that when you leave the chamber you do review the proceedings. We have always understood that when we're seeking to table documents, we are required to state the title of the document and the date or the place from which it came. On two occasions, whilst my colleague was trying to read out the full title, and these documents do have long titles, you cut him short with the explanation that's a full, good enough description of the document when he hadn't even completed the title. So how would you know?
I agree with the member. I will certainly review proceedings. Question number 10.